The National Football League is notorious for how swiftly and brutally it can end careers. It's got a variety of tools at its disposal and a long track record that grants it that reputation. So much so that as fans, we're conditioned to just shrug and move on when a player falls off the wagon. Sorry to see that happen, but also we're gonna leave you behind. Sometimes even with that understanding though, the crime feels just a little too perfect, a little too rapid of a fall from grace. That's why today we're going to try and figure out who killed Carson Wentz's career with the Eagles, because trying to decode what happened to Wentz in 2020 is like playing the most frustrating game of Clue ever created. You've got suspects, suspicions, and excuses for every direction, but the worst part is, maybe at the end of it all, it was just him the whole time. Lock in your predictions now by pressing the subscribe button. No, I'm just playing. But before we get into the rise and fall of the former face of the Eagles, I'd like to thank today's sponsor over at Omaze for helping me to make this video happen. Omaze is a unique fundraising company that centers on supporting great causes and offering some insane prizes for doing just that. Case in point, coming up is an opportunity to win a 2021 Bentley Bentayga and also $20,000 cash, with the best part being that a portion of every contribution benefits the Make-A-Wish Foundation. If you're wondering about the Bentley, it's equipped with a 4.0-liter twin-turbo V8 engine, 542 horsepower, and little touches like quilted leather seating and a hand-finished cabin that make it one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in my life. So if you're interested in the chance to win this 2021 Bentayga and an extra 20 grand for good measure, all while supporting the work of the Make-A-Wish Foundation, head to the link in the description at omaze.com/settheedge and use code SETTHEEDGE150 for an extra 150 entries. Again, that's omaze.com/settheedge and code SETTHEEDGE150 to make your donation and receive an additional 150 entries. So a huge thank you again to Omaze, and now, let's find out what went wrong. For those who aren't familiar with Carson Wentz's meteoric rise and the apocalyptic crash that followed, it's a path through 5 seasons unlike any other in NFL history. Wentz entered the NFL draft as a highly touted prospect out of North Dakota State, an FCS school, but the typical stigma that permeates draft discussion every time a small school is involved didn't faze the Philadelphia Eagles' love for Wentz as a prospect, and they put their money where their mouth is to trade up and select him with the number 2 pick of the 2016 draft. As it turns out, having elite size, athleticism, and intangibles make you a pretty good quarterback fit regardless of alma mater, and following a volatile rookie campaign, Wentz would progress in his second season to light the NFL on fire, supported by an exceptional coaching staff and one of the best rosters in the entire league. But despite being the frontrunner for MVP in just his second season, the first major blow to Wentz's career would come in December 2017, where his year would meet an abrupt end with an ACL tear against the Los Angeles Rams. If I'm remembering the story from there correctly, a mythical figure named Nicholas Foles entered through a portal from like 2014 and took helm of the first seed Eagles, leading them through the playoffs and bringing home Philly their first ring since the Liberty Bell broke. This run, while certainly the peak of many fans' lives, sparked doubt that Wentz was the messiah he'd been cracked up to be, and in the following season he would indeed return to Earth, also hampered by vertebrae fractures that would end his season prematurely yet again. In a case of deja vu, Foles would take up the mantle and lead another impressive run for Philly, going undefeated in the final 3 regular season games and even notching another playoff win that I'm going to shamelessly use to trigger Bears fans now.
Hits the upright again! That's impossible!
As you can imagine, this only raised further questions when it came to Wentz, his durability, and his overall impact on the team's success. Not to mention Foles, who had a style polar opposite to that of Wentz, had now posted a 4-1 playoff record, including a win in the Super Bowl. Well, 2019 would quell some of those concerns, with Wentz signing a massive $128 million 4-year contract extension and going on to play a full 16 games. Hell, he even dragged a barely living roster to the playoffs where he would make his first postseason start. But after all of that, the football gods refused to cut Wentz a break, as he would sustain a concussion just 9 snaps into that playoff game against the Seahawks. So to this point, Carson Wentz had endured adversity in every year of his career and come out stronger on the other side, but that cycle was about to shatter entirely. Due to a variety of interweaving problems that we'll get into, Wentz would put up the worst season of his career in 2020, leading the league in interceptions with 15, sacks taken with 50, and total turnovers with 19 on the season, despite being benched after only 12 games. Wentz compounded a set of performances that totaled a negative 35.9% DVOA last season. If you don't know what DVOA is, you can pause the video now, or just know that that number is 5th worst in NFL history among players with at least 400 pass attempts. For Eagles fans, it was dumbfounding. Wentz's 2020 meltdown wasn't just a step backwards, it was a historic collapse made all the more confusing by the fact that he was considered a lock for MVP exactly 3 years prior to being benched for a rookie. After the season, Carson Wentz would be traded to the Colts, netting the Eagles a 3rd in the 2021 draft and conditional 2nd in 2022, with the team now having to accrue the largest cap hit in NFL history to part ways with the player they just invested their future in 2 years ago. So what the hell happened to cause Wentz to fall off this dramatically, and at this point, is any of it fixable? Well, as for the list of culprits, identifying the biggest problem is not a simple task, as there's reasons both in and out of Carson Wentz's control that are responsible for this massive decline. The first big red flag is how much Wentz's mechanical problems as a passer were drawn out to the forefront in 2020. Since he was first evaluated as a prospect, there have been gripes about his throwing form, with a long, drawn-out motion and footwork that's often more sloppy than clean. But to this point in his career, those concerns have been muted to an extent by Wentz's ability to read the field and hit the open man way more often than not. However, that decisiveness evaporated into thin air in 2020, and as a result, Wentz's inaccuracy issues became much more costly. The first thing noticeable in watching Carson Wentz in 2020 is that he simply did not trust his receivers to make plays on the ball, often waiting way longer than usual to try and make sure they were open before pulling the trigger. While it might not seem like much, that fraction of a second is an eternity in the NFL, and Wentz's loss of anticipation went hand in hand with taking drive-killing sacks and allowing pressure to even further worsen his mechanics. His tendency to pigeon toe, pointing his lead toe away from the receiver he's targeting, limited the rotation of his hips and regularly caused accuracy problems, and that still isn't all. From having too wide a base that generated overthrows and underthrows, to regularly losing linebackers in his peripheral, these mechanics and decision-making issues are simply inexcusable for a fifth-year quarterback. However, placing all the blame solely on Wentz's shoulders would be just unfair, especially considering the void of talent around him that was the Eagles' offense. In part 1 of this video breaking down the organizational dysfunction of the Eagles, I discussed the draft record of Howie Roseman in recent seasons, which has been, in a word, garbage. Essentially, the team has failed to bring in new talent to succeed the old and overpaid declining veterans that make up the roster. Case in point, the Eagles' weapons center around an old guard that fell victim to father time in 2020, with Deshaun Jackson, Zach Ertz, and Alshon Jeffrey all missing large swaths of the year. The young talent left over behind either couldn't stay healthy themselves or couldn't gain Wentz's trust in a pandemic-shortened offseason. When you compound that with the fact the Eagles' offensive line was a revolving door of injuries, rolling out 14 starting lineups in 16 games with critical protectors lost for the whole season, all of a sudden your quarterback feels as though he's playing 1 on 11. The coaching staff and scheme of the Eagles' offense didn't seem to have a remedy for this either, with the play calling consistently lacking creativity, plays taking far too long to develop given the inadequate protection, or just being tone deaf entirely to what the situation called for. As was also discussed in the last video, the possibly forced approach of having multiple offensive coordinators only served to worsen the situation, with conflicting schemes trying to mesh and failing to do so in a natural way. So with Wentz losing faith in the offense around him and the play calls coming from the sideline, he would try and fail to win games on his own. Throughout his career, Carson Wentz has been a gunslinger, relying on his mobility to buy time for receivers to open up down the field. But while that mentality hasn't changed, his physical ability clearly has. Simply put, Wentz has never been as fluid evading pressure since his ACL tear in 2017, with it certainly not helping that he would sustain vertebrae fractures and a vicious concussion in the following seasons. We don't know exactly what extent these issues affect him today, but Wentz is a different player athletically than he was when he was at the top of the NFL. However, his mindset has not really adapted to this fact. Of course, you want your quarterback to be able to take things into his own hands and occasionally subvert the script based on what he sees pre-snap. But Wentz's hero complex became far more costly than it was beneficial, and from accounts within the team, he also decided at a certain point that he couldn't rely on the leadership above him, instead using his amount of control in the offense to kill play calls and then reconfigure based on what he saw. As you might guess, this went pretty poorly, feeding into more errant decision-making and later prompting a move by Doug Pederson to rein in Wentz's freedom and simplify the offense further. Naturally, for a player who already didn't trust his coach, this only served to widen the chasm between Pederson and Wentz, a chasm that would in part cost Pederson his job after the season. According to a report from Jeff McClain of the Philadelphia Inquirer, in 2020 there wasn't anyone left on the staff poised to check Wentz on his mistakes, with the closest to Carson being quarterbacks coach Press Taylor, a personal friend of his who failed to hold him accountable for his bad decisions and sloppy mechanics so as not to rock the boat too much. In 2016 and 17, Wentz's nature to go rogue was held in check by the stringent coaching of John DeFilippo and O-coordinator Frank Reich, but following their departures from the Eagles, Wentz allegedly grew more and more tired of taking cues from the coaching staff. A scathing report surfaced following Wentz's 2018 season that painted the quarterback as selfish, uncompromising, and egotistical, and though that report was challenged at the time by many teammates, later sources coming forward in 2020 seemed to indicate at least that some part of the Eagles' behind-the-scenes toxicity can be traced back to Wentz himself. Whether it was the coaching staff, the culture, or Wentz's arrogance at fault, that ship had sailed, and when he was benched after 12 games of poor performance, whispers began circling about Carson Wentz having played his last snap in Philadelphia. Though it seemed like nonsense at the time given the investment into his contract, when news of a trade broke in February, it became real that Wentz's time with the Eagles had come to a bitter end. No MVPs, no Super Bowl MVPs, no Ring of Honor, no retired numbers. Just a couple draft picks and a devastating amount of dead money to get his contract off the books. Wentz always wanted to be embraced as the savior of the Philadelphia Eagles, and part of the problem ultimately was that those at the top treated him like just that. Players like former Eagles safety Malcolm Jenkins have come out in saying the organization is partly responsible for Wentz becoming less coachable over time, giving him too much leeway, influence, and inflating his self-importance before he truly hit the apex of his career. Much has been debated about the effect of Howie Roseman drafting Jalen Hurts with their second-round pick in the 2020 draft, especially with Wentz only having just escaped the shadow of Nick Foles hanging over his career. While there's certainly evidence that kind of move can light a fire under a player, according to many sources in Philadelphia, Wentz felt it undermined the confidence the organization had in him. Obviously, making any concrete assessments about how it may have affected Carson Wentz mentally is a fool's errand, considering I am not Carson Wentz. But no matter where you base your argument most for Carson's decline on the field, either physically or mentally, the unavoidable truth is that Carson Wentz was broken as a quarterback in 2020. To put it bluntly, the Eagles killed Carson Wentz, and Carson Wentz killed the Eagles. That's a pretty good clue accusation. In reality, there's no good guys or innocent parties here, because the story of Philadelphia's self-implosion is a story of what happens when trust is lost from an organization at every level. Front office, coaching staff, quarterback, team, every one of them was hindered by arrogance and ineptitude, if not at their own level, then certainly up above. Of course, no one can ever take away the Super Bowl their team won in 2017, and this analysis was never meant to diminish that accomplishment. But in a way, the Eagles do make me feel a little bit sad, because they could have been a hell of a lot more had different decisions been made. Now, Carson Wentz will reunite in Indianapolis with Frank Reich, and his career now depends on if he can unlearn these regressive habits built in 2020 and trust again in the structure of the team around him with the Colts. Reich obviously has experience coaching Wentz and even in creating strengths after a down year, having done that for Andrew Luck in his first season as the Colts head coach. If we're honest, Wentz will never again be the same player he was in that explosive 2017 season. He just isn't the same athlete, and there's even evidence to say his success as a passer was based on some wildly unsustainable efficiency. But contrary to what some people think, Wentz has shown he doesn't have to be in that 2017 form to win football games, and after the season the Eagles had, it's undoubtedly his best option to get a fresh start somewhere new. Back in Philadelphia, they'll have to try and gather up the mess of pieces and dusty confetti still on the floor and try to start all over again, maybe with Jalen Hurts or a new quarterback of the future on a roster that needs help across the board. Regardless of what their plan is, one thing is for sure. If the Eagles fail to address the underlying problems that led to the downfall of Carson Wentz, don't expect them to take flight again with anybody else either.